You mentioned earlier there was a moment when things escalated so far that you even had to grab a knife, a simple steak knife, just to make a point. Here's the truth of it. Before it ever reached that edge, something had already shifted. We had built something together, something real. But then came the whispers, the sightings. He was being seen with another woman, publicly, and I was still his wife. That kind of thing doesn't stay hidden when you're dealing with someone like Muhammad Ali. He wasn't just a man, he was a spectacle larger than life, like an elephant walking through downtown New York. Impossible to ignore, impossible to conceal. When you live at that level, discretion becomes a myth. Every move is magnified. And I told him plainly, this isn't right. There's a line, a boundary, especially when you have a family, children watching, a legacy forming in real time. You can't behave recklessly and expect no consequences. Those carefree days, those were long gone. A man in his position had a responsibility to carry himself with dignity, but he didn't, and it was humiliating, not just privately, but in front of the world. I endured it longer than I should have. Try to hold things together, but there comes a moment when you realize nothing is changing. No effort, no correction, just repetition. So I made a decision. If a woman allows herself to be disrespected publicly, allows her family to be diminished, then she's betraying herself. And I wasn't going to do that. Not for anyone. Not even him. So I walked away. It wasn't easy. He made it clear he wasn't going to stop. Said promises had already been made elsewhere. But I reminded him I was the first promise. And I wasn't going to stand by while that was discarded. There were deeper issues too. Things far worse than what the public saw. But those aren't stories I carry into the light. Not because they didn't matter, but because destroying what we built was never my intention. People expect you to expose everything, to tear it all down. But I refused. I wasn't going to sit there and broadcast pain just to satisfy curiosity. That's not leadership. That's not dignity. And more importantly, it damages both sides. If I destroy his image, I damage my own in the process. Some things belong behind closed doors. What we had, despite everything, created something meaningful. People learned from it, drew strength from it. And I wasn't about to erase that just because things fell apart. I remember telling him once, as I was leaving, I'm going to write a book. He panicked, thought I'd expose everything, thought he'd have to disappear completely. But I told him, no, that's not what this is about. I wasn't there to tear him down. I was there to preserve the beauty of what we had, even if it didn't last. Life has a way of handling people. I didn't need to do that for him. And airing out everything publicly, that's not strength. That's chaos. What the world saw was already enough. There was no need to add salt to the wound. Over time, things settled. The storm calmed. We found a way to exist again, not as husband and wife, but as something quieter, friends, people who understood each other, even after everything. And when he became ill, when that disease took hold, it was painful to watch, truly painful. Whatever had happened before, none of that mattered in those moments. Because at the end of the day, life has its own way of balancing things. We all answer for our choices. And despite everything, I stayed present, not as a partner, but as someone who once cared deeply, someone who still saw the humanity in him. He had his flaws, many of them, but he also had a heart. He loved children, respected elders, carried a certain warmth that people don't always talk about. That part of him was real, and I choose to remember that. People lose their way sometimes. Fame does that. Freedom does that. You climb high, and sometimes you stop climbing. You settle on a branch and convince yourself you've reached the top. But I always believed there was more in him, more than even he could see. Maybe he stopped believing that, but I never did. And in the end, we had our children, a legacy that continues, strength that carries forward. Even now, that connection to the world of sport remains alive through them. So I look at the whole picture, not just the pain, but the good, the growth, the meaning, because that's what truly lasts. And time, it has a quiet way of reshaping everything. What once felt sharp begins to soften. What once felt unbearable becomes something you can finally look at without breaking. Not because it didn't matter, but because you learn how to carry it. There were moments, years later, when memories would return without warning. A sound, a voice, a flash of something familiar. And for a second, it all came rushing back. The laughter, the arguments, the weight of what we had built. It wasn't simple. It never was. But it was real. People often reduce stories like ours into headlines. Drama, scandal, betrayal. They look for villains and heroes. Clean lines, easy conclusions. Life doesn't work like that. There were mistakes on his side. That's true. But there were also pressures most people will never understand. A life lived under constant watch. Every move analyzed. Every flaw amplified. That kind of existence, it changes a person. Not always for the better. But still there's a choice. There's always a choice. And that's where everything either holds together or falls apart. In our case, it fell apart. But it didn't end in hatred. That's the part people don't expect. Because even after everything, after the disappointment, the distance, the decisions, I never lost the ability to see him as human. Not just a legend, not just a name, but a man who struggled, who stumbled, who sometimes lost his way. And maybe that's why, in the end, there was peace. Not perfect peace. Not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that allows you to breathe again. We spoke differently in those later years. Slower, softer, without the noise that once surrounded us. There was no need to prove anything anymore. No need to win, just understanding. And sometimes that's enough. Because when everything is stripped away, the fame, the image, the expectations, you're left with something simple. What did you build? What did you leave behind? For us, it wasn't just memories. It was family. It was influence. It was lessons. Some learned the hard way, but learned nonetheless. And I hold on to that. Not the chaos, not the hurt, but the meaning. Because in the end, that's what defines a life. Not the moments when everything went right, but how you carry what went wrong and what you choose to become after. And as the years stretched on, something else became clear. Growth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slips in quietly, almost unnoticed, until one day you realize you're no longer the same person who once stood in that storm. There was a time when everything felt urgent. Emotions ran high. Decisions were sharp, immediate, final. But distance has a way of changing perspective. It teaches patience. It teaches restraint. It teaches you what truly matters. I began to see things differently, not through the lens of pain, but through understanding, not excusing what happened, but recognizing the full picture, the pressures, the expectations, the weight he carried every single day. It doesn't justify the choices, but it explains them. And sometimes explanation is what allows healing to begin. People often ask if I ever wish things had turned out differently. The honest answer? Of course. Anyone would. When you invest your heart, your time, your belief into something, you don't imagine it ending the way it did. But regret is a heavy thing to carry. So instead, I chose acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't mean forgetting. It simply means you stop fighting what's already happened. You stop trying to rewrite a story that's already been lived. And in that acceptance, there's freedom, a quiet kind of freedom, the kind that lets you move forward without dragging the past behind you like a chain. We both moved on in our own ways, different paths, different lives. But the connection, what we shared, never completely disappeared. It couldn't. It was too deeply rooted. And in those later years, there was a sense of closure that didn't need words. Just presence, just respect, just the understanding that, despite everything, we had been part of something significant, something that shaped not only us, but the people around us. And that matters, because at the end of the day, life isn't measured by perfection. It's measured by impact, by what you leave behind, by how you rise after you fall. He had his journey. I had mine. And somewhere in between, there was a shared story, imperfect, complicated, but undeniably real. So when I look back now, I don't see just the pain. I see the lessons. I see the strength it took to walk away when I needed to, and the grace it took to return, not as who we once were, but as who we had become. And maybe that's the final truth in all of this. Not every story is meant to last forever, but every story can still mean something.